A tired soul in a divided world. The winter air carried a tired chill through Montgomery, weaving itself into the heavy fabric of Rosa Parks' coat as she stepped off the curb. Evening shadows draped the city streets, but Rosa moved with a quiet determination, a woman molded by years of silent endurance. Her hands, calloused from hours of sewing at the department store, clenched the strap of her worn handbag. Another long day blurred into the endless rhythm of surviving in a world that insisted she was less. Montgomery was a city humming with invisible lines, lines Rosa crossed daily in the eyes of those who demanded her obedience, her deference, her silence. Storefronts glowed with whites-only signs, bus seats were reserved for those born into the right color. Yet Rosa carried herself with a grace that no law could shatter, a dignity stitched into her soul more tightly than any garment she had ever crafted. Inside the bus, the stale air smelled faintly of dust and worn-out patience. Rosa made her way to the section labeled "Colored," where the seats were cramped and second-hand. She slipped into an empty seat, placing her handbag on her lap, her body aching from the long hours on her feet. Around her, faces mirrored her exhaustion: nurses, janitors, clerks, all carrying invisible burdens heavier than any day's work. As the bus rumbled forward, picking up new passengers, the tension grew. It was an old, familiar ritual. If the white section filled, the driver would demand that black passengers relinquish their seats. No arguments. No questions. Only obedience. Rosa knew the rules. She had known them since childhood, when her grandmother first warned her about the consequences of forgetting her place. But tonight felt different. She thought of her grandfather, who had once sat on the porch with a shotgun across his knees, determined to defend his family's dignity against the night riders. She thought of the young men she had seen dragged away for less. And she thought of herself, not as a symbol, not as a cause, but as a woman who had simply had enough. The bus jolted to a halt. A group of white passengers boarded, their chatter sharp in the thick, suffocating air. Rosa's heart quickened as the driver, a man whose face she recognized from earlier humiliations, barked his command, "Move!" The passengers beside her shifted nervously. One by one, they stood, surrendering their seats without meeting her eyes. Rosa remained still. The worn leather seat beneath her, the creaking frame of the bus, even the startled glances around her, none of it mattered anymore. She was not moving. In that moment, Rosa was more than weary. She was a quiet rebellion wrapped in a plain coat, staring back at a world that demanded her submission. The bus driver's voice rose again, louder, more insistent. Rosa looked out the window, where the sunset bled into the horizon, and felt a quiet, unshakable resolve settle over her. She tightened her grip on her handbag. She was staying put. The world, though it didn't know it yet, had just begun to shift. The seat that shook a nation. The silence on the bus thickened, wrapping around the passengers like a suffocating shroud. Rosa sat unmoving, her hand steady despite the rapid hammering of her heart. The driver, James Blake, glared at her, his face turning an ugly shade of red. Years earlier, he had thrown her off a bus for a similar offense. Now, history circled back, daring her to fold once again. "You better make it easy on yourself and get up," he barked, his voice cutting through the tense air. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting furtive glances toward Rosa, as if proximity to her might summon trouble. Rosa's gaze remained calm, almost serene. She did not raise her voice or plead her case. Instead, she answered with a simple, steady word. "No." That single syllable cracked the invisible walls of fear and habit that had kept so many in silent compliance. It wasn't shouted, it didn't need to be. It carried the weight of countless indignities, countless moments of shrinking herself smaller just to survive. Blake muttered under his breath, storming to the front of the bus to call the police. Rosa sat still, her breathing slow and deliberate, as if anchoring herself against the storm she had summoned. Time stretched thin. Passengers avoided her eyes, pretending to be invisible, pretending not to witness history being quietly written in the middle of an ordinary street in Montgomery. The patrol car arrived within minutes, sirens silent, lights off. 2 officers boarded the bus, heavy with authority, their belts clinking with the tools of enforced order. One of them, a younger man with a narrow, suspicious gaze, stepped forward. "Why don't you stand up?" he asked, voice low but dangerous. Rosa looked at him, her expression neither defiant nor fearful. "I don't think I should have to stand up," she said evenly. There it was again, the quiet rebellion, the immovable dignity. Without further exchange, they arrested her. As they led her down the aisle, the world outside the bus seemed indifferent. Cars moved, streetlights flickered on, and life in Montgomery drummed on, unaware that it would soon be forced to listen. Rosa walked without resistance, every step a quiet affirmation that she would no longer yield to a system built to break her. The jail was cold, impersonal. They took her fingerprints, her photograph. They catalogued her like an object, not a human being. Yet even here, Rosa's spirit remained unbroken. Sitting alone in the holding cell, she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. She thought not of herself, but of the thousands who endured daily injustice without voice or witness. Tonight, she had spoken, for herself, for them. Somewhere deep inside, a realization stirred. Something had shifted. A dam had cracked, and though the break was still invisible, the waters of change had already begun to rise. And Rosa Parks, the woman who had simply chosen not to move, was now at the center of the storm. A ripple becomes a wave. By morning, word of Rosa Parks' arrest had spread like wildfire through the black neighborhoods of Montgomery. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into gatherings. Churches became rallying grounds, barbershops and kitchens turned into planning rooms. The news struck a deep, raw chord. Rosa's simple act of defiance was a mirror to the collective exhaustion of an entire people. E.D. Nixon, a seasoned activist, visited Rosa that morning, his eyes blazing with urgency. Together, they understood, this was more than one woman's burden to carry. It was a spark, and if tended carefully, it could ignite a fire no force could extinguish. By nightfall, a plan had formed, a one-day boycott of the city buses. Flyers printed hastily in basements and back rooms fluttered across Montgomery like secret invitations to a quiet rebellion. Don't ride the buses on Monday, they urged. Walk, share rides, stay home. Let the seats stay empty. Monday dawned gray and uncertain, but the streets spoke louder than the skies. Buses rolled by with rows of empty seats. Drivers grumbled at the lost fares. Black workers trudged miles to their jobs, shoes scraping against the cold asphalt, faces set with quiet resolve. Elderly women leaned heavily on canes, refusing to bow to convenience. Children skipped alongside their mothers, oblivious to the historic weight of their small steps. Rosa watched from a borrowed chair in her living room, her home now crowded with organizers and neighbors offering news and encouragement. She listened as reports trickled in, buses eerily silent, businesses complaining, officials fuming. Yet the victory came with a cost. Because of her arrest and growing prominence, Rosa lost her job at the department store. Her husband Raymond faced mounting pressure at his own workplace. Threats whispered over phone lines. Strangers loitered near their house at odd hours. Fear became an unwelcome companion, lingering at the edges of their lives. Still, Rosa stood firm. She wasn't alone. In kitchens and pews, in hurried whispered prayers and determined marches, she saw her courage reflected back at her 1,000-fold. The Montgomery Improvement Association was formed to sustain the boycott, led by a young, relatively unknown pastor. Martin Luther King Jr. His voice stirred the people, but it was Rosa's quiet action that had lit the path. Weeks stretched into months. Winter melted into spring, and still the buses ran nearly empty. Families carpooled, neighbors formed walking brigades. The city officials tried everything: legal intimidation, economic pressure, threats of violence, but Montgomery's black community, inspired by Rosa's simple refusal, held the line. One evening, Rosa sat alone, stitching a torn coat under a dim lamp. Her fingers worked methodically, but her mind wandered. She thought about the countless feet trudging along Montgomery's dusty streets, each step a silent act of resistance. The cost was heavy, but so was the hope. And deep down, Rosa sensed the tides of history were shifting, slow but unstoppable. The question was no longer whether change would come. It was how far it would go. The legacy in quiet footsteps. The months wore on, each one heavier than the last, but the people of Montgomery refused to bend. As Rosa Parks sat in the quiet of her home one December evening, the air around her buzzed with the weight of something nearing its breaking point. Then, the news came. The United States Supreme Court had ruled segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. The long, grueling boycott, 381 days of walking, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve, had triumphed. The invisible walls that had boxed them in for generations had begun to crack, letting in a sliver of long-denied light. Rosa didn't shout or weep when she heard. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the silence speak for her. She thought of the weary footsteps pounding Montgomery streets, the children who would grow up sitting wherever they pleased, the ancestors who had endured chains and cruelty for this moment of simple, stubborn dignity. But victory did not erase the scars. Even after the buses were desegregated, Rosa found herself ostracized. White employers shut their doors. Threats still darkened her doorstep. She and Raymond eventually left Montgomery for Detroit, seeking quieter lives far from the battlefields they had helped forge. Rosa worked as a seamstress again, piecing together garments for modest wages, her name known across the nation but her daily life as ordinary as ever. History books would one day elevate her to myth, but Rosa Parks remained, at her core, a woman who had made a decision not in anger, but in quiet certainty. She did not see herself as a hero. She saw herself as someone who could no longer tolerate the small, constant cruelties that had defined her life. In speeches and interviews,